What's going on, everybody? I get messages all the time from you guys asking how to use a specific hero or how to use a specific card, and I try to cover as much as I can, but deck guides, they take a lot of time to make. But I do think there's merit in covering a lot of ground, especially when there's a big meta shakeup in TEPPEN like what we just got with the Force Seekers. That's why I brought in my good friend Iowa. Most of you know him really well. He's a well-respected community member. He leads the Discord, the Reddit, plus he's also a really smart player. What's going on, Iowa? What are we talking about today?
It's going good. It's going good. We're talking about different archetypes that you may see in the meta, especially if you're a new player. This would be very good information for you so that you can know ahead of time, what to look out for, what's out there.
Also, I think it's important that we point out what we're about to present people is not a tier list. This is more of a meta snapshot of the decks that are movers and shakers right now. We're not going to specifically number and say this is best, this is worst. This is just what you're probably going to encounter while you play the game.
So Ryu Shinku Hadoken is one of the original 8 heroes, but I think that Ryu best defines the Season 1 meta the best. And that was because he, for the most part, he dominated very early of that meta, and it's just been an established deck even to now. The whole concept of the deck even survives 7 months later. The goal of the deck is to, play units that have on-play abilities. And when you have that, you're essentially destroying your opponent's units while placing your own units, constantly maintaining a good board state for yourself and minusing your opponent. Now with Shinku Hadoken at face value is one of the best, if not the best hero art in TEPPEN. It's very, very clean value.
I also think it's important to point out that the way Ryu is played, he's probably the most honest hero in the game, just based on Red's style of dealing direct damage. In terms of your timing, there's something to be said for playing a deck that just relies on straight damage and there's no other tricks or turns about it.
I agree with that. Yeah, there's nothing there's no real funny business. It's really much about, counting and timing, like you said. So in that sense, it's very fair because you know what you're getting.
I think Ed is a great card. I think he's very, very strong. I think he's a really solid replacement for a lot of cards that kind of function similarly. He just has really great value. Spiral Pegasus we've talked about. Guaranteed damage, even bigger damage if you ascend. While the stat spread's not great for the amount that you're paying, you are getting really solid damage out of it. And I think the general consensus with Infernal Magma Dragoon is that it's a really good card. I would certainly say one of the best legendaries we've been given, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Strength and weaknesses. I think we covered strengths, but we can talk about weaknesses. What do you think?
I think, while I do think this deck is certainly capable against a lot of different archetypes, I think it's certainly going to struggle against a very well-timed Yawn, just because Yawn at the moment is very creature heavy, because you get so much value and so much MP that you're way ahead of the curve of your opponent. So you can just drop units consistently, and green units naturally have high health totals, which is something that Ryu has a really hard time dealing with unless you are incredibly precise on your game and, to be honest, a little bit lucky.
I agree with that as well. I think there's one advice that I always give to, players that play against Ryu, because there are players out there that think Ryu's too strong, this and that. Everybody kind of has their own thing. What I would say to them is what you want to do, try to make the abilities that Ryu puts down as minimal as possible. You can do that by playing multiple units. You can also do that by playing units with higher health. I say very simple, but it's probably easier said than done. If Ryu cannot kill your board, you're probably going to win.
Rathalos is not something that people are going to see a ton of, but I do think there's merit in talking about it, just because at its core, the foundation of what has made Rathalos with Wrath Awoken as good as it's always been, is still a strong core. But in terms of tools, what they got from the new expansion, it's not much. So if you're going to run into a Rathalos, what you're going to see is much of what you're familiar with: the Iris, the Lair, the Feline Beast Cannon, lots of disarms, a few shields thrown in there, more than likely Nidhogg. I do think players have the opportunity to change it up. I think Ed is a decent fit in Rathalos potentially. I think there's also some potential with either Steve Burnside, even Blade with his agility. I think agility plus flight, as we've seen with some other of the new units, has the potential to be really snowball-y. I think, but it's just not going to be as popular as other decks that rush down a lot faster. Like, let's say you want to play a deck that's about building up a board and dealing lots of damage and, you know, using the ramp to have tons of resources to build up a big board and overwhelm, because that's what Wrath does. But why would you play Wrath over, some of the other decks that have similar functions? You may not. It may just be strictly based on I like Rathalos.
Right. Like you said, you're mentioning the new decks out there, and they are different than the Rathalos, because the Rathalos is a take, which is the mana boost deck from previous seasons. Anything we see now is not going to have mana boost, but they're just as aggressive, which is really interesting. So when we talk about this deck, we're talking about a deck that, it's starting to phase out a little bit. It's getting old. The mana boost. The whole reason why you want mana boost is because you want to, beat the board, buff your units, and then keep the mana boost so you can ramp, right? So when it comes to those two decks, the new aggressive stuff, the old mana boost aggressive stuff, they're very different. That's a really tough one. I don't think I can answer that.
I'm not sure. I think that also has to do with the fact that it's not as good as other options that you can play, and at least in my experience, because I've tinkered with Wrath on the ladder a little bit, because the idea of red-green rushing stuff down is, I like that playstyle. The problem is, even with all of this MP boost and this ramp, if you come up against a Yawn player, you are not going to have MP advantage against them. It's just not going to happen. The rushdown decks that are good right now say, obviously I won't be MP above the curve, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start dealing damage, and it's going to happen immediately, and I'm either going to win or lose the game in 60 seconds. That deck can't do this. Could you hit champ with it? Absolutely. I believe you could hit champ with Wrath. It won't be as easy as other decks, but there you go.
So with Yawn, I've already said this once. I've said that this is a tier 0 deck. I still stand by a little bit, but maybe not as much as before.
I think maybe you put a little bit of hyperbole on it.
Just a little bit.
That's okay.
But it's also shout outs to the community. So the reason why I'm kind of like backing off on tier 0 a little bit more is because now the players that played against it, they can, see a game plan, figure out how to play against it. Let's talk about the strengths of the deck first.
Sure.
So this is a new archetype, coming from the Force Seekers. Ascension has been the new mechanic. Essentially, you can destroy a unit on your board, and then you can play a new unit that's just, gains bonus effects. Honorable mentions here are Huitzel and Rainy Turtloid. The sole reason why you play those cards is because you can destroy the units and they become fat bodies that just control the board. Now, with Yawn, a lot of players have already speculated that Yawn was going to be busted because of how the new mechanic worked. Yawn says when a unit of yours leaves the field, then you get +4 MP. And that's something about TEPPEN is that, time considerably, both players will always have the same amount of MP, as time goes on. It just depends on how you spend that MP. Unless you have MP boost, or if you have, Yawn, that's going to put you up ahead. And that's what this deck does very well, is within the first minute, you can use the MP boosters to ramp, kill them off, establish board, and you just run with that advantage. It's very fast.
And I think there's something to be said for the play style and the popularity. I think something else that contributes to it, not, setting aside the idea that it's really good, because it is really good. I'm not denying that at all. Just the core function of Yawn saying, oh, well, unit doesn't have to specifically die. If it leaves the board, you get the benefit. Now, the fact that this deck gives so much value makes it a little cabbagey, in my opinion. And when I say cabbagey, I mean a cabbage head could play it. I mean, it's very straightforward. You have tons of value. Just use your value to keep putting units out, and you're going to overwhelm your opponent. I'm not dogging anybody that plays this deck, because I'm certain that I'm going to play it at some point. I haven't yet, because there's a deck I love a little more. Struggles for this deck, in my opinion, I think 4s can really hurt this deck, because a lot of it gets targeted by 4s. And I think decks that have the potential to basically beat Yawn in terms of speed. And what I mean by that is they have to start dealing damage quickly, and they have to have methods of dealing damage that involve ignoring whatever they put on the board. Do I think this deck, in terms of everything else that's been presented to us so far, do I think it's number one? Yes. Do I think it'll stay that way? No.
I agree with that.
Nero's in a weird place because at first glance, when he first came out, a lot of us were like, wow, his hero arts are really good. But then when the meta started to, settle into its foundations, Nero kind of fell by the wayside. But why would you play Nero over someone like Nergigante, who does the same thing but also has a reliable board clear? I'm not saying that Nero is bad. It's just if you wanted to play the play style that Nero is good at, there's better ways to do it. And while the true power growth version of Nero was making waves there for a little bit, I think you would agree with me in saying that Ascension is just better than growth. It's better in almost every situation.
Yeah, most definitely. I think one notable mention about this deck is that the Force Seekers added a new card. I'm pretty sure you know what I'm already talking about. It's the 2 MP action that gives like +3/+3 if you have ascended at least once.
That's Starvation Impulse for people who aren't familiar. And you're right, it's very good.
Mm-hmm. So that is why I, really wanted to feature this deck, because that means that what you can do is you can buff your units to a considerable amount. Why is Nero Devil Breaker Black-Green better than Nero Devil Breaker Red-Green? And the whole reason was because of Psycho Power. It wasn't because, black's a cool color, or, I want to cut my life for buffs. It's because of the toughness that you get from Psycho Power, and now you have Starvation Impulse. That toughness is going to go a long ways, and it's going to give your opponent a heck of a trouble. So that's why I think that, if anybody tried this deck out, it probably worked very well for them.
It's interesting that you bring up red-green, because I experimented a little bit with red-green. I haven't settled on anything I'm happy with. And you brought up the factor of toughness playing into it. I think that's a really important thing for people to keep in mind, because if it were all about attack buffs, you would just run red, because red does have attack buffs too. In fact, they have that 1 MP cost card. The name escapes me.
Frozen Fang?
No. It's Catalyst. But because red has that new card Catalyst, which says it's 1 MP, gives 1 attack for each time you've ascended this battle, which is pretty good. I mean, 1 MP for potentially a lot of attack is good, but in most situations that unit is going to get 1 swing. Whereas if you add durability to it and increase their health, you're going to be sticking around for a little bit longer. You're getting better value. It leaves your MP available to use to protect your board, not just refilling your board and feel like, it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back every time. The points that you made about why this deck is better are totally solid.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sweetheart. All right, we can talk about Jill now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So for Jill, we have Tarakumon's list is not even a list of, me or Stouts. And Tarakumon is, for anybody who doesn't know, he was the 2nd place, finalist for the World Championships of last year, which was like a few weeks ago.
He was the kid that was very emotional. I say kid, he's 18. But he was the one who got really emotional on stage, and I couldn't help but root for him. Anyway, we say all that to say he's a smart player.
Correct. And what I really like about this list, and it is a different take from, last season's, essentially what this deck does is it rules the skies. The previous version of Jill, it used to be a deck where you would, manage the board, play a very mid-rangey tempo type of game, and, play for board. Now, with this build, however, this one is all about flying, because you have this card on here that is called Unleashed. Unleashed is an Explore card. If you have explored at least 3 times, your unit gets +2 attack and flight. With Nash, that could be a considerable amount of damage. That's like 12 to the face, right? The reason why there's the shift from the control Jill deck to this Jill deck, it's because there are cards in the game now I'm talking about Oro. What Oro does is anytime he takes damage, that damage is immediately reduced to 1. For red players, that's a really big pain in the butt. And because of that, that's why, Jill players are looking to add in flight into their decks.
Flight's just a more reliable way to ensure that you're dealing your damage, and not every deck has a way of dealing with flight fast enough. And I think another important point is a lot of the Ascension units that we got, none of them really fit into Jill's playstyle all that well. The only one that I would even consider would be Ed may work in favor of Nash here. But the only problem is you have to ascend. You can't just play him raw and get all the benefits. Because you'll notice on this list, Ascension is basically nowhere to be found except for an Infernal Magma Dragoon, which, as we mentioned before, is just a really good card. What do you think this deck does well against?
Honestly, I would say that it does well, decently against anything that's not Chun-Li, but I'm going to say that a lot of times tonight.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to get over Chun-Li. I've been even watching streamers play against this. It's just not favorable. But other than that, I do think that this deck has a lot of, power that you can just get through. As long as you have the strategy lined up, you should be fine.
So the idea of 4s has kind of shifted to this idea of 3.5 because there are, some lesser cost cards that are valuable to run, and some of the parts of the core of 4s that made it so strong during Day of Nightmares are still really good. So the deck that's become popular is kind of this idea of mashing both of them together and taking the good aspects of both decks and coming up with, a compilation of sorts. And this is kind of what it looks like. Four Eyes, Beltway, Lupo, Hunk, Hell Antinora, Tigrex, all of these should be familiar just based on how popular 4s was back in the day. The new stuff here that makes it particularly good, Oro, we mentioned earlier, when he's ascended, any damage that's dealt to him is reduced to 1. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't matter if it comes from a unit, an action. It doesn't matter if this thing gets Shinku Hadoken in the face and it's ascended, it will take 1 damage. That's really, really powerful. And then you've got Bulwark, which, if I remember correctly, when explored, he comes with little buddies, right?
Correct. He gets a little doggo. It's like a 5 cost, and it has rush and combo, and it has 3/5 stats.
Yeah, that's really good value for, if you have a setup for it. That's really good value for 7. So, and you got the other core pieces here that make this super viable. Brainwashed is always good. Demonic Intimidation is especially good now because it targets much of what makes Yawn so good, because most of those units fit in that threshold. So I think part of the reason this deck has become so strong is because it can hang with Yawn.
How do you beat this deck? The best way to beat it is to gain MP advantage. That's a very old theme or topic that used to be said for a lot of TEPPEN players when you're first starting out. How do you gain the advantage? Well, it applies here. If you're playing against 3.5, what you want to do is to outvalue them and get a board established and make sure that you have, your investment is staying on your board, and then theirs is like going away. It's going to be a little bit hard to do that, but that is exactly how you play the matchup. And that's how you would be able to win. Mono Black, for example, they have cards like Murderous Spikes. So if your opponent, plays a unit, then you just straight up kill it. Or Betrayal, the new card, kill it. Kill the unit. Everybody's favorite deck, Resonate. So this is Morrigan Resonate. There's only like 2 card changes with this deck, but a lot of the reason because of that is, what Resonate does is they board lock you, and they fly over, and, they deal direct damage. You wouldn't be able to do much. There's not a lot of interaction. And the reason why there's only 2 card changes is because, a lot of the old stuff was already synergetic. There's not a lot of, moving pieces. But other than that, the deck still keeps up with, a lot of the new decks that we see now.
Ceasefire, when initially unveiled, was kind of a, why would they design this card? It just makes Resonate even stronger, which at the time, Resonate was already really good. Ceasefire, I don't think, is as impactful as people were anticipating it being. I think Crimson Viper is definitely a new MVP for this deck because of her sustainability. Even if you were running multiple copies of Crimson Viper, and let's say it gets targeted by Betrayal, it will one copy will always go back to the EX pocket. This card never goes away, and she has great stats. And within, I believe it's 3 resonates. It may be 2. I'm not sure of the math. But after 2 or 3 resonates, she's dealing the same damage output that an Ibuki would. So how do you beat resonate for everybody that hates this deck?
Well, Ascension really helps because now you can play cards when you're board locked. Mm-hmm. But besides that, you really need to focus on shutting down their unit. And when you're building decks out there, you want to make sure that you have, some answers in your deck. It doesn't have to be like a whole lot, but that's what you want to work up towards. Now, there's just so many intricacies with Resonate that you want to be very creative with how you play your game, because sometimes, against Resonate, a lot of my matches on stream, I never, feel pressure to play a card at 10 MP. Sometimes I'll wait for the right moment and then keep one unit out, wait for my opponent to do something, and then I'll react. I won't just just because I hit 10 MP, I'm going to play a unit after a unit after a unit. I want to make sure that I'm watching and reacting, making sure that I stop what they're doing.
I think Ryu still has a decent time against this deck because the importance of units cannot be stressed enough for this deck, because of all the decks that's listed in here, Resonate is the most action heavy of any deck by far. So the margin of error in terms of keeping your units alive is even more important to keep track of. And Ryu, with the right timing, has the potential to say, no, I will not let that Ibuki survive, or no, I'm going to keep you recycling that Crimson Viper because I don't want to deal with it. The Dante decks are going to look almost virtually identical to what you will get out of Resonate. With Morrigan, for me, the big difference between Dante Resonate and Morrigan Resonate, like I said in the guide that I did a few weeks ago, I think a lot of it is personal preference. Do you want to have that damage and vulnerability every once in a while, or do you want to have that halt on deck for those big moments? I think it just really boils down to what suits you better as a player. Much of what we would say here would be almost identical to what we would say for Temptation.
Right. Exactly. So this is Dark Destruction Wesker, and Mono Black, coming into this season with how they're being played, you still have the same, idea. You want to destroy cards and play for board. That's exactly what you have here, is you have a lot of removal, especially, if you're playing against like Yawn Chun-Li. That's why we have the 3 betrayals and a lot of removals, is so that we can keep up in the game while maintaining pressure. I would categorize Albert Wesker as kind of like an anti-meta deck, because this build specifically really hits on Yawn Chun-Li, and it can fight other matchups pretty well.
Just as a hypothetical, let's say that you ascend a gate on top of a T002 Tyrant. If they have a lot of batteries out, that will wipe all of their batteries. It's a guaranteed way of triggering Tyrant the way you want to. I think there's some merit in talking about a few of these new cards. Starvation Impulse, we already mentioned. Alexia Ashford is insanely good in terms of Ascension units. She's the 5-cost 3/8 that when she ascends, she destroys a unit of 5 MP cost or less. That's huge. Gets so much value off of that. Cruel Game is a legendary that can essentially be a board wipe if you have nothing on the board, because it evens out the amount of units between yourself and the enemy. And Betrayal, as we mentioned before, can purge all remaining copies of a unit if it's targeted correctly and the unit's not in the hand. So this just has the ability to put the brakes on a lot of what Yawn and other decks in particular, Resonate included, are really good at doing. Uroboros is the more popular version of Wesker. I'm not necessarily saying it's the better version, because I think that line it's really unclear now in the new expansion. But the idea is something that you saw at Worlds. You have big creatures like Gormagala and the Tyrant and Devil Joe, Living Death as a last resort kind of situation, bringing units back from the graveyard for lots and lots of value. But the new expansion didn't really give a lot in the way of Uroboros, or cards
Right.
that benefit Uroboros, as you'll see in the list that we're going to show.
And this list in particular is actually Spooky Graveslave's deck, which was very popular towards the end of last season because it started to float online, and then a lot of players started playing it, and immediately the feedback was like, whoa, this is a different way of playing, Ouroboros, because this deck, focuses less on having units and more on, just actions, and then just being very hyperly aggressive early.
Right. And there's just not a lot that came out that's new that really lends itself to that kind of play style. I'm not saying there aren't one or two cards that could fit into a deck like this, because I'm sure there are. But that at this core function, I still think it works well. So now onto my question that I thought of when we were talking about Dark Destruction. Which one of these two varieties of Wesker do you think is stronger at the moment?
That's a really good question. So I like both decks for different reasons, right? So the Albert Wesker, and this is going to be a hot take, but I think that Albert Wesker Dark Destruction is better than Akuma Raging Demon.
I don't disagree with that, actually.
But as far as like which one is the better deck for the current meta, I would have to say probably the Dark Destruction one, just because I know that Yawn Chun-Li is a thing, and I really, if I was to pick a deck into ladder, I would want to make sure that I could, beat these Yawn Chun-Li players.
And Dark Destruction will target almost all of that deck. So the popular version of Nergigante up until this point was black and green. A lot of players are putting stock in the mono black as being the way to go because it deals effectively against a lot of what Yawn is really, really good at. But I have not played this deck myself, so maybe you can go a little bit more in depth into it.
Yeah, so with the mono black Nerg, and I do have to give, a small shout out to Batman, or Bat. You guys who know him in the community. He showed me his first list. So, and what I'll say about mono black Nergigante is that they really play for a lot of crazy stats and early advantage. So they get the early advantage by cutting health, but then when it comes to like mid game where they're like half dead because that's what they do, they cut their own life. They can start getting more value just because of like Burn Dynarex gets, becomes a 4/8 body. Dynamo, early game he becomes like a 4 something body, and then Malphas, 4/9 body with life gain attached to it. So the deck Nergigante has a lot of versatility, and it definitely, fights very strong compared to a lot of decks as far as like putting units out on board.
I think there is merit in saying that this is the stronger version of Nergigante, but I have seen more black and green Nergigantes than I have this specific build. But I think that will change. Raging
Demon Akuma, definitely one of the more hyped characters that has come to TEPPEN for me, because I'm a big Akuma fanboy right now. Actually, it's because of TEPPEN. But besides that, we have the Raging Demon build. It is mono black. And what this deck excels in is being able to ascend for, considerable amounts of stats on board, as well as hard removal. So a lot of what you'll see in this list is focusing on hard removal, and all of it really, fits into what you'll see into the meta. So that's why, we're showing you this deck, because this is very similar to what you'll see.
I do think there's a couple of important things to point out here. This is your build. This is different than the one that I put out a deck guide for, but there's a lot of similarities across the board. G-Adult being a really good way to get cheap ascensions, which is what he's there for. Alexi Ashford we already touched on. The Epic Akuma being a little bit different. It's not something I included on my list. And then you running 3 betrayals and then the cruel game. I prefer 2 betrayals and 1 obliterate, just in case you run into something that betrayal cannot target. Murderous Spikes here I think is a good addition for getting rid of low cost batteries. At least at the moment, I think this is the weaker Akuma deck.
I agree with that.
I'm not saying that argument is done, but just in the way that things have shaped up. I mean, this is definitely more of a, this is a mid-range more of a control style deck with all the destructive effects, whereas the deck we're about to talk about functions a lot differently.
Correct. For me, this deck plays a lot like how I would play Ryu, except I feel like Ryu's a little bit better because, you know, when you're playing units in Ryu, you're always getting some type of value. With Akuma and this type of deck, if you miss, you know, an ability or something like that, it's just not going to work out too hot. That's what I've noticed with this deck. It plays very fair, right? Just like how we're talking about Ryu plays fair. This deck plays fair.
Yeah, there's an honesty to this deck. The last deck we want to take time and talk about specifically is the purple-black variant of Akuma, which uses Ashura Senku, which is his teleport move, which says for 16 AP, you can choose a unit that gets Veil for 10 seconds, and if available, that unit will switch into an empty board slot when that is activated. If not, you can still use it. The unit just won't move board places. It'll just get the Veil effect and the damage immunity. It also comes with damage immunity. So this deck lives or dies on winning the game as quickly as it can. With a lot of the new units like Palomu, you know, you've got Pyrobat from an expansion ago. You're also running other a lot of people are running Crow, which is a core card. You know, it's just all about getting in there and dealing lots and lots of fast damage before your opponent can kind of react to it. I think this is the best variant of Akuma at the moment. It can contend with Yawn. I'm not saying that it has a favorable matchup against Yawn. I think it's 5-5 at best. But if you can get an advantage over Yawn and fly over a bunch of their creatures and largely ignore them, then you can win the game.
So with this build and Akuma Ashura Senku, their whole idea is to, you know, win the early game and then also be very difficult to deal with. One of the best cards that we've talked about in this video is Starvation Impulse coming into the set because it's the +3/+3. Now, the reason why, you know, the deck is built the way it is because, you know, Palumu is, you know, a really big threat, especially if you put a bunch of buffs on it. Same with Pyrobat, Oro. Jury's kind of like, okay, she's more of fodder, but she can be good too. And the reason why she's in the deck is so that we can, you know, hit Ascended. You know, besides, you know, some other black cards like maybe like Vega, you know, Jury can ascend and trigger that Starvation Impulse because you do need ascended units in there. With this build in particular, the reason why we do a lot more, you know, purple units is because of double trigger. And then Junie's in the deck because, you know, if you sacrifice her, you get +1 MP.
Let's talk about the decks and heroes that weren't in this list, and that's just because they're not having any form of impact. I think the first one is X. People are going to say, well, where's X? I know a lot of people like X, but he's just not very good. His hero arts don't have a lot of direct board impact whatsoever. They take time to set up in an appropriate way, and any deck that you can generally make for X would be better played with another hero. Almost
Correct.
Every time. I think if X players are going to be dedicated to something, I think with a lot of the new Ascension units that Heart Tank is the way to go. So I think there's a deck out there. I don't see any X anywhere in my rank climbing. So how can we say it's having an impact on the meta if it's not there?
Correct. Same here. I think you can make some jank versions though, like Oro with Heart Tank.
Yeah. That's actually not a bad idea.
It's really gross.
Another thing that we talked about, but we don't want to specifically include, and that's Metsu Shoryuken Ryu. Red got a lot of really good fast tools. Blade in particular sticks out in my mind, and a lot of the really easy buffs to achieve that could make Metsu good. The problem is a lot of the elements that make Metsu good also function well in Shinku, and at the end of the day, you should just run Shinku because it's one of the best hero arts in the game.
Yep.
For its cost. So you may see some Metsu decks. I've seen a few in climbing in the ranked ladder, but they're just not as scary as Shinku. So that's it for our meta snapshot. I do think it's important for us to remind you one more time that this is not a tier list. We're not going to rank these decks. I just think it's important that we kind of talk about what's having a presence in the metagame right now.
Most definitely.
And Iowa, you've done everybody a favor by compiling all of these deck lists into one little place, and we're going to put the link in the description.
Most definitely.
So I think this is also a good chance for us to let you know that we stream Teppen on Twitch. So if you aren't already following us on Twitch, I'm going to make that super easy for you, and I'm going to include the links to that in the description as well. So you should go follow us to make sure you know when we're live.
Yo, thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.
Bye, guys.